Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how I turn this sketch of koi fish into this pixel art image using Photoshop. So the image that I made was in my sketchbook, and I took a photo of it and put it on the computer and scaled it down to 100 by 100. The fish on the bottom left was drawn from a photo reference, and the one that I'm tracing now, the top one, was, I kind of tried doing on my own. It's why the bottom one has a lot more visual interest, and the top one looks even smaller. I changed the composition a little bit by moving the fish a little to the side, and I just made two layers, like a background layer and a silhouette layer, where I have the shapes of the fish. And by having those two layers separate, I can kind of go in and paint broad strokes in those big two shape layers without having to worry about spilling onto the background. So I did this with the least amount of colors possible. I haven't counted them, but they're probably like 12 colors or something like that. I needed two main colors, a sort of cream or white color or ivory color for the bright parts of the koi fish, and a red kind of brick color for the red parts of the fish. And then I would have an extra shade for when the head of the bottom fish is poking out of the water. So I would have to have a brighter shade because it was being shadowed by the water itself. Added to that, I have these highlights, which are just to convey that the fish is wet because it's just poking out of the water. I don't do that on the part of the fish that is submerged, because even though it is wet, the whole surface does not reflect the same way. I do add texture, and I'm trying to suggest here some texture by creating the idea of fish scales, even though in these fishes the fish scales aren't that pronounced. But they still exist, and it's still nice to convey an idea of texture because it helps break up the flatness of some of the colors. I'm also using a dark shade of cream there to suggest different planes on the fins and tail of the fish. The tail on this fish, I made it brighter because I also wanted it to poke out of the water, but I wasn't able to sort of solve what the ripples look like as the tail comes out of the water. Does it even have the tenacity to come out of the water? Would it just sort of collapse as it pokes out? So I end up just submerging it back again, and I'll do it in a bit. But right now I'm kind of creating texture both on the fins and on the fish itself by adding different shades. I created a new layer to add sort of the little ripple of water around the head of the fish, which is sort of poking out. And I use these two tones of blue. One of them I'm going to make a little bit darker because I just want to have the idea of a shape and then a little bright and sharp highlight on the water, which is going to be sort of justified by the highlights on the fish as well. So they both work in coordination to create the idea that the light is up and a little to the left. The other thing I'm going to do to add more light information is to just actually have shadows of the fish in the bottom of the pond. I realize now that maybe the color of the water could be a little bit more green or a little bit darker, but I kind of like the blue because it reminds me that it's sort of reflecting the sky color. So here I'm trying to do the ripple around the tail, and the ripples have to be circular, but it didn't feel right. So maybe the whole idea of having that bit of fin coming out is something that I wouldn't be able to solve in the amount of time that I sort of put aside to do this. This was a 45-minute image, and a lot of it is sort of sketched in and drawn in, not so much carefully placing each pixel, which I guess is fine for a practice piece. But I start feeling like the parts of the fish that are underwater do not seem to have like the visual interest that they should. So I create this shade, which I'm going to use to sort of suggest scales as well as on the white bits. And at this point, I remember that I years ago did an image that was this skull filled with diamonds. Someone commissioned me to do that. And I created that sort of pattern for the diamonds, which is basically that 4x3 pattern that I have. And it kind of really works well to suggest scales without being too sort of obvious. So the fish coming out of the water projects a little bit of shadow on the water itself, and they will both project the color on the bottom. So here what you see me do is I created a brush with that sort of scale pattern, and I'm using that to sort of speed up the process of doing the fish scales. Some of you might feel that that's a bit cheating, but I will assure you that all of my clients will disagree with you. Clients love when you deliver things quickly, so we use whatever shortcut you can. Just don't steal anyone's work, basically. In this case, I'm adding the same pattern and highlights on the bright spots on the fish, and I want the head of this fish to sort of tilt down a little bit more, and that's why I brought the highlights more to the top bit, and the bottom of the shape, which is the head of the fish, I made it a little bit darker. So here you see me duplicate the layer of the silhouettes of the fish, and I just paint that layer dark, the same as the color I have on the head of the fish on the left in the water. And by doing that, I'm offsetting the fish up from a certain plane just by moving the shadow. So now the fish are floating somewhere, which basically is what swimming is. The fish are basically flying underwater. It's just that the density of water is different than the density of the air. But the idea there is that that shadow is enough to suggest the direction of the light, but as well the tilt of the angle of the light and the depth of the pond in this case. I didn't change the shadow of the fin, which I just twisted the fin, because a 2D shape in the end is a 3D object, so it might be rotated in some angle that will produce a different shadow, so it's fine. I'm adding some maple leaves on the water, like if they had fallen into the water. And I'm adding that little tip shadow just to suggest that the tips of the leaves are sort of curling up a little bit, which I think happens often. I'm lucky enough to have this kind of tree in my garden, so I'm looking at it as I'm drawing, kind of making sure that these don't look like pot leaves, which is something people have said previously of some of the maple leaves I've drawn. So I have clearly misjudged the shape and did something that wasn't the same. So what I'm trying to do here is to blur the shadow just a little. And it worked the way I did it, but it made the shadow bigger, which it really shouldn't, as the object goes away from the light source. As the object goes away from the projection plane, the plane where the shadow is going to project, the shadow will either get big or small. It'll get big if the light is a light that is close to you, so like a candle light or a spotlight, but the shadow will actually fade and stay the same size if it's a faraway light, like for example the sun, which in this case is what I'm trying to suggest. So I instead blur the color inwards just by making a lighter shade. And I do the same with the leaves, and here I add some little like pieces of bread or something that people are throwing into the water to kind of, feed the fish. And adding some final details, really just try to tie in. I try a little thing which is to have a reflection of a building, and I'm trying to kind of drawing a building upside down seen from below, so I'm having a little bit of trouble imagining this. It doesn't seem to work, so I add the gradients just to see if I'm wrong or if it's not well done. And it turns out that it was just not well done. So I just decided to just scrap it. And I ended up with this. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and take care. I'll see you around.